The Green Beret had survived 41 months of special operations across 3 countries, 2 of them active war zones, and had never once been put on the ground by another human being. He called the 135-pound man in the corner of the gymnasium a Hollywood prop, said it out loud in front of 11 members of his unit in a Fort Bragg training facility on a Thursday morning in the spring of 1969. 6 seconds after he said it, Staff Sergeant David Carver was on the training mat with no clear understanding of the sequence of events that had placed him there. The 11 men watching did not move. The gymnasium smelled of rubber mat and old sweat and the specific industrial cleaning solution the Army used on every hard floor in every building on every base in America, a smell so universal that soldiers stopped registering it entirely, which meant that when something genuinely unusual happened in a room that smelled that way, the smell was the last thing anyone remembered. What they remembered instead was the 6 seconds, and what happened in the 11 months after the 6 seconds that none of them had anticipated when they walked into that gymnasium on a Thursday morning. The question is not what happened in those 6 seconds. The question is what David Carver did with what he learned, because he did something with it that surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. Stay with me. David Carver was 31 years old in the spring of 1969. He had enlisted at 19, gone through the Special Forces qualification course at 23, and had been operational ever since. 8 years of deployments, rotations, and the specific, continuous low-level readiness that Special Forces soldiers carry in their bodies even on the days when nothing is happening. He was 6 feet 1 inch. He weighed 285 pounds at the time of the events in this account. Not competition weight, not parade weight, operational weight. The weight of a man who runs 6 miles before breakfast and spends his afternoons doing things that do not appear in any publicly available training manual. His physical record across 8 years of service was the kind that circulates in the specific oral tradition of elite military units, passed in hallways, mentioned in briefings, becoming more specific and more serious the further up the chain of command it traveled. He had been involved in 7 hand-to-hand situations across his deployments. In all 7, the situation had ended when David Carver decided it should end. 3 of those 7 situations had involved opponents who outweighed him. 2 of those 3 had involved opponents who were themselves trained fighters. The outcomes had been the same. He was not cruel about this. That is the first thing his former unit members say when they describe him, and they say it consistently enough that it is worth noting. Not cruel, precise. There is a difference, and the men who served with him understood it. He did not enjoy the 7 situations. He was good at them. Those are different things, and David Carver had been clear about the distinction since at least year 3 of his service, when a senior NCO had told him that enjoying it was the one thing that would eventually get him or someone around him killed. He had taken that seriously. By the spring of 1969, David Carver was the kind of man who could walk into a room and have the room understand, without anything being said, that the physical calculus had just changed. Not because he announced it, because it was simply true, and truth has a way of communicating itself through posture, through the specific quality of a large trained person's stillness, through something in the air pressure that experienced people feel before they can name. He had never met a room that didn't rearrange itself when he entered. Until Fort Bragg. Until a Thursday morning in the spring of 1969. Until a gymnasium that smelled of rubber mat and old sweat and Army-issue cleaning solution, and a 5'7" man in the corner who had not looked up when David Carver walked in. That detail, the not looking up, was the first thing that registered, not as a threat, as an anomaly. David Carver noticed anomalies. It was part of the job description. He filed it. He kept moving. He had been told 3 days earlier that a civilian consultant would be present at the Thursday session. He had been told this by his commanding officer, a man named Colonel Hess, who had the specific communication style of someone who has spent 30 years giving people information they need and nothing more. Hess had said, "Civilian consultant, Thursday, movement and situational awareness." He had not given a name. He had not given credentials. He had given David Carver a look that meant, "Take it seriously," which David Carver had processed and filed alongside the other things he was carrying that week. He had not, in the processing and filing, altered his fundamental assessment of what a civilian consultant at a Fort Bragg training session represented in terms of the physical landscape of the room. This was not arrogance, it was experience. The consultants came through periodically: academics, analysts, former operators who had transitioned to different careers. Some of them were interesting. None of them had ever required David Carver to recalibrate anything. He looked at the 5'7" man in the corner, and he made a calculation. The calculation took less than 3 seconds, and it produced an answer that 8 years of operational experience fully supported. He said the words out loud because he was comfortable enough in that gymnasium with those 11 men to say what he was thinking. Hollywood prop. Said it directly. Not loud, just said it, the way you state something that doesn't need emphasis because it's already obvious. He had no way of knowing that the civilian consultant had heard him from across the gymnasium. He had no way of knowing that the civilian consultant had been hearing variations of those 2 words, in that specific tone, since he was 18 years old and had first tried to explain to the larger people around him what he was and what he could do. And he had no way of knowing that the civilian consultant had, over the years between 18 and 28, developed a response to those 2 words that was not anger, was not performance, was not the need to prove anything to anyone in the room. The response was simpler than that, and it arrived in 6 seconds. I want to be honest about something before we go further. When I first started pulling on the threads of this story, I expected to find what I usually find in accounts like this: a confrontation between 2 skilled people, a clean outcome, a lesson that everyone present understood immediately. That's the shape these stories usually take. The shape fits. It satisfies something in how we want the world to work. This story does not have that shape. Or rather, it has that shape on the surface for the first 6 seconds, and then it becomes something else entirely. Something I didn't see coming when I started, and that I'm still not entirely sure I've fully understood. The 6 seconds are real. What happened in the gymnasium on a Thursday morning at Fort Bragg in the spring of 1969 is not in dispute among the people who were there. 11 witnesses. All of them consistent on the sequence. All of them consistent on the outcome. What I couldn't have told you when I started is what David Carver did 18 months later, and I couldn't have understood what that meant without spending time with the 6 seconds first. So we're going to spend time with them. The civilian consultant had been working in the far corner of the gymnasium for approximately 20 minutes before David Carver's unit arrived. He was not using the bags. He was not using the weights. He was doing something that looked, to the untrained eye, like nothing. A series of weight shifts so small they were nearly invisible. Footwork patterns that covered almost no ground. Hands moving through positions that didn't correspond to any martial arts vocabulary that the men in that room would have recognized as serious. His name was Bruce Lee. He was 28 years old. He was 5 feet 7 inches and weighed 135 pounds. He had been in Los Angeles the previous year shooting a television series called The Green Hornet, which had been canceled after 1 season. He had spent the year before that running a martial arts school in Los Angeles that was, at that point, becoming known in specific circles for producing fighters who were disturbingly difficult to deal with in ways that formal martial arts competition could not easily quantify. He had been contacted by someone in the Department of Defense. The chain of contact is not something I've been able to fully reconstruct, about conducting a series of training consultations at military facilities. Fort Bragg in the spring of 1969 was the 3rd of those consultations. The 2 previous consultations had produced paperwork. The Fort Bragg consultation produced something that did not appear in any paperwork. He had heard the words Hollywood prop from across the gymnasium. He had registered them with the specific quality of attention he gave to all information that arrived in a room, not reacting, just cataloging, the way water catalogs the shape of whatever it's moving around. He finished what he was doing. He set his feet. Then he looked up. The 11 members of David Carver's unit described what happened next in ways that are consistent on the result and inconsistent on every specific detail. One man said he saw 3 movements. One man said he saw 1 movement that contained 3 things. One man said he blinked and it was over. The former Special Forces sergeant who gave the most detailed account, in an interview conducted in 1991 for a documentary that was never completed, said this: "I have seen fast. I have trained with fast. What happened in those 6 seconds was not a category of fast I had a name for. It was like watching someone work in a unit of time that was smaller than the one we were using. What is not disputed. David Carver, 6 feet 1 inch, 285 pounds, 8 years of Special Forces operational experience, 7 hand-to-hand situations with 7 identical outcomes, was on the training mat. Not injured, not struck hard. On the mat, in a position from which he could not have moved without Bruce Lee's cooperation, in 6 seconds, having experienced a sequence of events that his body had registered and his mind had not yet processed. Bruce Lee released him, stepped back, returned to his original position in the corner of the gymnasium. He did not say anything. The gymnasium was the kind of quiet where you become aware of the ventilation system, where the hum of the fluorescent lights becomes audible, where 11 trained soldiers, men who had been in situations where the air itself had weight, stood completely still because the room required it. David Carver got up. He straightened his uniform. He stood still for a moment. He said one word. He said, "Again." Here is where the accounts split, and I want to be accurate about what I know and what I'm reconstructing. The session ran for 4 hours and 30 minutes after the first 6 seconds. This is confirmed by the duty log, which recorded the gymnasium's reservation block, and by the consistent testimony of the 11 unit members who were present throughout. What happened across those 4 hours and 30 minutes? What Bruce Lee demonstrated, what he explained, what David Carver asked, and what answers he received, exists only in the accounts of the people who were there, none of whom gave formal statements, and most of whom have spoken about it only once or twice across the decades since. The picture that emerges from those accounts is not what I expected. It was not a master class. It was not a demonstration. It was closer to a conversation conducted in a language that didn't use words, a 4-hour exchange between two people who understood the physical world in ways that most people do not, and who had just discovered that the other one understood it differently than they did, and who were both interested enough in that difference to spend the rest of the day finding out what it meant. The 11 unit members, to their credit, did not leave. They watched. A few of them participated when invited. All of them, in their separate accounts across the following decades, said some version of the same thing. We had no framework for what we were watching. It was not what we trained to do. It was not what we had seen anyone else do. It was something else, and we spent the whole afternoon trying to find words for it and mostly failing. The sergeant who gave the 1991 account said, Carver asked him at some point in the afternoon how long it took to learn what he was doing. And the answer, he didn't quote it directly. He said he didn't remember the exact words, but he remembered the meaning. The answer was something like, the learning never stops because the system isn't a system. It's a way of seeing. And once you start seeing that way, you can't see the other way anymore. He said Carver was quiet for a long time after that. He said, I remember thinking that was the look of a man who had just understood something that was going to cost him something. I want you to sit with what I just told you, because it connects to what happened 18 months later in a way I wouldn't have seen if I hadn't spent the time with the afternoon first. In the fall of 1970, David Carver put in his separation papers. 8 years of service, 7 operational deployments, a record that his commanding officers described in language that does not appear in public documents. He separated in January of 1971 with a rank of Master Sergeant and a physical record that remained, at the time of his separation, intact. He moved to Los Angeles. He spent 7 months, from February to September of 1971, studying at a martial arts school in the Chinatown area of Los Angeles, a small school above a restaurant that smelled of training sweat and old wood and the specific liniment that serious practitioners use on joints that have been asked to do things joints were not originally designed to do. The school had a maximum enrollment of 20 students. David Carver was one of them. The instructor of that school is not named in any account I have found, but the school's location and its description and the period, February to September 1971, place it in a geography and a timeline that overlaps with something documented. The period immediately before Bruce Lee departed for Hong Kong to begin shooting The Big Boss, which production records confirm began in March 1971 in Pak Chong, Thailand. I am not stating this as confirmed fact. I am stating it as the thing that the timeline cannot avoid suggesting. What I can confirm, from the account of a former unit member who stayed in contact with Carver across the years following his separation, David Carver spent 7 months in that school. He studied what he studied. He left in September of 1971, which is, the production records again, the approximate period when the instructor of that school was no longer in Los Angeles to teach. He went back to work, not military work, a different kind of work, in a different kind of room, that drew on a different kind of understanding than the one he had built over 8 years of service. He never spoke publicly about the afternoon at Fort Bragg. He spoke about it once, privately, to the former unit member who has been the most forthcoming source in this account. He spoke about it in 1987, over dinner in a restaurant in San Diego, 18 years after the Thursday morning and 6 seconds that started everything. He said this. I'm giving it to you as close to verbatim as the source can remember, and he remembers it well because he wrote it down the same night. David Carver said, I walked into that gymnasium thinking I understood the geometry of a room, where the exits were, where the weight was distributed, what was capable of what. I had been right about that geometry for 8 years without exception, and in 6 seconds I found out that the geometry I understood was a subset of a larger geometry that I hadn't known existed. It wasn't that I was wrong. It was that I had been doing correct math in a smaller universe than the one that was actually there. He stopped. He drank from his glass. He said, the Hollywood prop line. I've thought about that for 18 years. I wasn't wrong about the surface. I was wrong about what was underneath the surface. And the thing that keeps me up is, how many other times have I looked at something and seen the surface and called it the whole thing? The former unit member said he didn't have an answer to that. Carver said, neither do I. But I've stopped assuming I know the answer before I look. I want to ask you something directly, because this is the part of the story I keep returning to. The 6 seconds in the gymnasium are the thing the title promises. They're real, and they're earned, and by the time you're reading this, you've seen enough to understand what they meant in that room on that Thursday morning. But the 6 seconds are the door. What's inside the house is the 18 months and the 7 months in a school above a restaurant in Los Angeles, and the dinner in San Diego in 1987, and a man who spent 18 years asking himself a question he didn't know how to answer. I want to know which part of this sits with you. The 6 seconds or the 18 years. Because when I started this, I thought I was reporting the 6 seconds. I ended up spending most of my time inside the 18 years, and I couldn't tell you exactly when that happened. Leave it in the comments. I read them, and I mean that. This is specifically the kind of thing I want to know what you make of. There is a detail from the Fort Bragg session that none of the 11 witnesses mentioned in their first accounts. It appeared only later, in the 1991 documentary interview, from the sergeant who was the most observant of the group. He mentioned it at the end of the interview, after the camera had been running for 2 hours, the way people mention the thing they've been carrying longest when they finally run out of everything easier to say. He said that at one point in the afternoon, during the 4 hours and 30 minutes after the 6 seconds, he had been close enough to hear a specific exchange, not the full conversation, a fragment. David Carver had asked Bruce Lee a question. He didn't hear the question. He heard the answer. The answer was, I am not afraid of the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once. I'm afraid of the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. He said he didn't fully understand it that afternoon. He said he had spent, by his count, somewhere between 300 and 400 hours across the following decades thinking about what it meant. He said he still wasn't sure he had found the bottom of it. He said, that's how you know a thing is real. You keep finding more of it. David Carver practiced the thing he learned in that 7 months in Los Angeles for the next 31 years. Not competitively, not publicly. In the specific private way of a man who has found something that reorganizes how he moves through the world and who doesn't need an audience for it. In 2002, at the age of 64, he gave a single interview to a small publication focused on the intersection of military training and the martial arts. He was asked what had most influenced his thinking about physical confrontation and self-understanding across his career. He said, Fort Bragg. Spring of 1969, a Thursday morning. The interviewer asked what had happened. Carver said, "A man showed me that what I thought was a ceiling was actually a floor." He said nothing else about it. The interviewer moved on. The quote ran in the fourth paragraph of a piece that most people in the publication's small readership skimmed before turning the page. I found it 3 years into researching this story, in a physical archive in a library in North Carolina, in a file that had not been opened in 11 years. I sat with it for a long time before I understood what he meant. The ceiling was his 8 years of operational certainty, the geometry he had mapped completely, tested thoroughly, trusted with his life. He had built that ceiling carefully and had every reason to believe it was the top of the room. The floor is what you're standing on when you discover there are more rooms above you than you knew existed. 6 seconds on a Thursday morning in 1969 to turn a ceiling into a floor. 31 years of climbing after that. That is not a small thing to do with 6 seconds. That is not a small thing to do with a 135-pound man who didn't look up when you walked in.